All right. Hello and good afternoon, arts advocates, and welcome to Americans for the Arts and the Arts Action Fund's office hours with our arts advocacy team. My name is Morgan Fernari. I'm the manager of the Arts Action Fund. I am a 29-year-old white woman with freckles and wavy, short, shoulder-length hair. I'm wearing a non-collared navy blouse and sitting with some artwork behind me in my home in Miami, Florida. Americans for the Arts is committed to accessibility, and this includes our speakers offering visual descriptions of themselves, which makes the webinar more accessible for audience members that are blind or have low vision. Additionally, there are Zoom-generated closed captions for audience members, and you can access those closed captions by selecting the CC button in your Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen. This webinar also includes live American Sign Language interpretation, which you can access by clicking on the globe icon in the Zoom toolbar and selecting ASL interpretation. We welcome our interpreters, Gina and Lucy, and thank them for their help today. Next slide. All right, so of course, as always, we want you to ask your questions. That's what office hours is all about. And you have access to the Q&A feature, which is located also in your Zoom toolbar at the bottom there. That way you can ask our speakers questions throughout the webinar. We will do our best to answer all questions, either by responding through the Q&A feature or during the allotted Q&A segments of the webinar. This webinar will also be recorded and will be available for you to watch and share in the next week. You will also be able to find additional resources on our office hours landing page, and the link is going to be shared soon. In the event that we don't answer all of your questions today, please reach out to Americans for the Arts Public Policy Manager, Olivia Tarpley, and that way we can all keep in touch. Next slide. So, today's session will feature a conversation between Americans for the Arts' Public Policy Director, Tushar Swain, and Brownstein's Policy Director, David Reid. As the House returns to Washington, D.C. to try and completely end this shutdown, which we're very thrilled has happened, they'll break down the latest developments, including the fact that this was the longest shutdown in history, the federal appropriations process we should expect, and any recent election outcomes, and what this all means for our federal cultural agencies and arts funding. We'll then have a Q&A session using the questions you've asked in the feature in Zoom. After that, Americans for the Arts Public Policy Manager, Olivia Tarpley, will give us some updates about current funding numbers for FY26 appropriations, and both Olivia and Tushar will then answer any further questions you have. At the end, I'll be back to share additional information about how you can take action and continue sharing your story with us. Now on the next slide, we can see our staff speakers. So that's myself, Morgan Fernari, Tushar Swain, and Olivia Tarpley. And finally, on the next slide, you'll see our guest and expert speaker today, David Reid, who we are so thrilled to have with us. So without further ado, I am going to say welcome to Tushar and David so they can begin their discussion. Thank you all for being here and take it away.
Hello, everybody. My name is Tushar Swain, Director of Public Policy at Americans for the Arts. I am a middle-aged man, brown skin, bald head. Today I'm wearing black glasses and I have a maroon striped shirt on. And I am thrilled to introduce our special guest today. David Reid is Policy Director at Brownstein, one of the top law and lobbying firms in the country. David works with clients to lead complex public policy efforts related to infrastructure, hospitality, healthcare, arts and entertainment. David leads Brownstein's bipartisan political operations, setting the industry standard for political engagement each cycle with Republican and Democratic congressional and national campaign committees and candidates. David is an active member of the firm's pro bono committee. He also leads the firm's LGBT and employment resource group. David, welcome. We are so glad to have you with us. Would you mind giving a physical description, please?
Absolutely. Tushar, Morgan, the rest of the team, thanks so much. It's an honor to be here again. Again, it's David Reid. I'm a 41-year-old white male in a blue suit and a purple-ish tie with brown hair, and sitting in an office here in New York today. Looking forward to the conversation.
Great. Thank you so much again for being here. So we are back in business here in Washington, D.C. Can you give us just some background on the legislative package that was passed and that has the government reopened again?
Absolutely. So, in short, it's a hybrid. You have a 3 full-year appropriations bill plus a short-term CR package for everything else that was passed, with a side promise on ACA subsidies, but with no actual fix. So, kind of the key points to look at are that, Congress passed HR 5771, which was that compromise spending package. And then that is what ended the historic 43-day long shutdown and now funds the government through January 30th. So that's the new deadline that we're all marching toward. What's fully funded for the rest of FY26 are, as I mentioned, those 3 packages: Ag FDA, which includes a number of the nutrition provisions, WIC, rural development, core USDA operations, Milcon VA, as well as the legislative branch. So our friends on the Hill are now getting their paychecks. Those three were packaged into the minibus portion that have now become full-year appropriations. And then the stopgap is everything else. So that's what's taking you to January 30th, including Interior and Labor H, which I know we care most deeply about. So we'll be continuing to monitor what negotiations come out of these next few weeks. And a few other policy nuggets in that package. It freezes Trump's federal workforce downsizing campaign, at least until January 30th. As I mentioned before, it fully funds SNAP through the end of FY26. So food benefits won't be at risk, at least until after that period of time at the end of the fiscal year. And it does not, as I mentioned before, extend those ACA premium tax credits. But instead, it promises that separate Senate vote in December.
Thanks, David. And so there was an agreement on a Senate vote on ACA. Has there been an agreement on the House side?
There has not. And I know that there has been some confusion as to what this means exactly. So if Congress can't reach an agreement on the AC subsidies, a number of folks have asked if whether or not they'll be eliminated. They won't be eliminated, but what will be delayed or will expire are the subsidies, which are the enhanced subsidies that have been put in place time and again over the last few years, which is what's leading to the very likely increases that a number of folks started seeing in their notices that they got at the beginning of this month. So under current law, temporary enhancements were created by the American Rescue Plan, extended by the Inflation Reduction Act. Those are the things that will expire, and then you'll go back to those amplified rates that in some cases can be between 100 and 400% of what folks had previously been paying. So that's what they're talking about, and then trying to have a vote to extend those. And then there have been a number of Republican proposals, given the fact that it is somewhat politically toxic, anything related to extension of Obamacare subsidies. So you're going to continue to see provisions coming out of House and Senate Republicans on another fix. You've also seen the president talk about, giving checks to folks to spend on their healthcare, going through HSA accounts and the like. But that's going to be really what's going to cause this next cliff come into January.
Got it. And so so it sounds like there are Republican proposals out there. Does that mean that, I mean, it is with the Senate's vote, this is obviously going to then take some floor time, taking us up to the end of the year, or how do you see that playing out?
Sure. So, I think that, right now the Senate is committed to provide or to having a vote at some point before the end of the year. That was the deal that the Senate Republicans cut in order to allow for the Democrats to come on board for that vote that opened the government back up. So when that vote does happen, we expect nearly all or nearly all Democrats, plus a few Senate Republicans, especially from states that had Medicaid expansion or are in high cost areas, to support some form of the extension. The open question right now is the scope, full versus scaled back extension, or whether it's paid for. So those details will really determine, if we get, 55 votes in the Senate, which would not be enough to pass and then go to the House, or something closer to 60, which is the number, the magic number in order to get that, done. Looking over at the House, Speaker Johnson, as I mentioned, hasn't committed to bringing any kind of a vote. With the Freedom Caucus being strongly opposed and others in the sort of more right wing of the party citing costs and, again, just ideologically being opposed to the whole concept. You've also got a number of external stakeholders that are very engaged here. You've got insurance companies, hospitals, governors, and a number of other business groups that are concerned about uncompensated care that would come from this, given the fact that with these increasing costs to the individual payer on the exchange, you're going to have a lot of folks drop their coverage, which is going to be a big drain and problem for all of those stakeholders that I just mentioned, especially with the governor's offices and the governors who are having to balance their own budgets, going into a very precarious year on any other number of fronts. So I think most likely path is the Senate potentially passes something bipartisan with a partially offset extension. And then, at the end of the month in January, the speaker faces a choice as to whether or not he'll allow for a vote that would require mostly Democratic support or risk another shutdown when that CR expires.
Right. Now, I guess that was, some of my thought whenever I was asking the question. I mean, this is also going to be taking up some precious floor time. We have, presumably leaving for Christmas break as well. And so, the timeline seems tight again, right?
It's incredibly tight. And, folks that I'm talking to on the Hill, especially those that are building out committee calendars and hearings and markups, they're basically saying, if you remember back in high school doing sports, it's, like two-a-days. They're going to be trying to cram basically 3 months of work into one leading up to the winter recess in December. And then, of course, you've got that mad dash upon their return in January. So a very truncated schedule, and one where there's a great deal that has to be accomplished in the lead up to yet another cliff at the end of January.
Thanks. I did not like 2 days in high school either. Um, so moving on. So you said, right, that part of the legislative package was the minibus of the three bills that you mentioned, which was Ag, Milcon VA, Ledge Branch. How there was talk about, maybe a couple other minibuses moving during the shutdown and so have they talked about a process moving forward for the for the bills that they need to get accomplished by January 30th?
Yes, so there has been talk of another minibus that would package 4, potentially 5 bills. And those 4, potentially 5 are THUD, so transportation, housing, and urban development, defense, labor H, commerce, and then potentially interior, which is one that Tom Cole, whom we all know, has floated as being included in that next tranche. However, there's really no finality to that at all. Leadership hasn't agreed to how to package them together, nor is there a top line discretionary spending level for FY26, which is incredibly important especially for labor H. Typically, that's required in order for them to be able to move that bill. So, again, yes, that's the next tranche that folks are talking about. But there's a lot that needs to be done in order for there to actually be movement on that front. From leadership and the appropriations cardinals on down to the committees that would have to produce those products.
Got it.
Not to mention, as I said, the top line numbers, the House and the Senate numbers are still very far apart within those bills, especially labor age.
So you said it's THUD, Defense, Labor, HHS. What was the fourth one?
CJS, Commerce, Justice, Science, and then Interior.
Got it. And obviously for arts advocates, Interior is one of the most important bills for us because it houses the funding for National Endowment for the Arts and National Endowment for the Humanities. Do you know of is there a reason why it's not just, explicitly being listed with the other four?
So the question is, why it's not automatically being,
Yeah,
added to those.
yeah, yes.
I don't know the answer to that. And
Okay.
I'm actually, and a number of folks are somewhat surprised that they're proposing including some of the more controversial
Right.
bills, especially HHS is notoriously difficult because oftentimes you have a number of policy writers that snag the gears. And then you've also got a number of controversial provisions in CGS that would potentially delay the consideration. So, I think there is a little bit of, confusion as to why those particular ones are the ones that they're trying to have be the next. Just given that they are notoriously tricky. Interior is not typically tricky. And I think that's partially why Cole and others, would like to see that included. And it's also not, one of the larger ones given, the amount compared to some of the others. So yeah, it's a little bit of an unknown on that. And right now, unknown as to whether or not they'll actually be able to get that pulled together, given so many things that have to happen in order for that to happen.
David, is there any, talk in terms of where they're going to go with those top line numbers? Like some of them are just so far apart. Is it, just as simple as meeting in the middle? How do you see that playing out?
Sure. I think the in numbers are going to be closer to the Senate number than the House number, just generally, because the House numbers were basically taking what is normally seen as a political document, the president's budget request, and marking up to those numbers, or in some instances below. And everybody knew that that was a political exercise. Now, the Senate marked up at something that is more of a level and flat funding number and more realistic. So I think that again, the number that the Senate pushed out is not going to necessarily be the end number, and the House numbers are certainly not going to be the end. But you're going to see something that is more in the middle, I would think, skewing more towards the Senate numbers.
Got it. And then for these four bills that you mentioned that are potentially on tap, there has been no timeline as to when they would try to bring those together for a vote.
Not that I've seen. They would like to obviously they would like to get these moved over the coming weeks. But like we talked about a little earlier, there's a lot that's getting a lot that has to be done as we barrel toward that December recess.
Maybe just switching a little bit, and this maybe be a segue to some election talk. We always value your expertise. What is the messaging for this government shutdown, both from the Republican standpoint, what do they, what are they going to message as to what they won as well as Democrats?
I think that, there has not been in recent history a real win for either party coming from a shutdown. Whether it's the party that is pushing for the shutdown or is seen as causing it and is quote unquote blamed, or those that are seen as being held hostage. Nobody really wins. It's an extremely expensive endeavor. It costs a great deal of money for there to be a shutdown. And, at the end of the day, typically you don't get what it is that you're pushing for. There was not a great deal of difference in the deal that was offered to the Democrats at the very end of this than was at the very beginning. Obviously, there can be messaging that's being done around it. It raised the importance of certain issues and put to the forefront the cost of healthcare in the national conversation. And I think there are benefits to that, of course. But I think at this point, I think most folks, at least congressional incumbents, are hoping that this is not something that is top of mind. The shutdown itself is not top of mind. Come time to cast votes next year. And I think the real thing that I think folks should be looking at is the impact of the shutdown on the elections that took place last Tuesday. And I think the president acknowledged it, and I think a lot of the pollsters are realizing that the shutdown did net benefit Democrats going into that. But also it allowed for us to see that, cost of living and affordability really is, the issue that if you're a, political message maker, you should be focused on ensuring that your candidate is laser focused on. I think those are some of the things that we can derive from that. And again, the messaging around the shutdown was, the cost of living, the cost of healthcare, these are things that are going to skyrocket and go up. And that's what the Democrats were trying to, message that they were fighting for. And I think that at least that line and that tinge of an argument did actually break through and helped in states like New Jersey and Virginia and a few other states where we had, elections on the state and municipal level.
Great, that's fascinating. And how do you see that playing into your, looking at your crystal ball into November, particularly, the congressional elections, what's
Sure.
going on in the House, what's going on in the Senate?
Yeah. So, again, just kind of looking back to what happened last Tuesday, Abigail Spanberger flipped the governorship with a very healthy margin, much higher than expected. She carried the attorney general along with her at a much higher margin than he was expected to win by, actually due to a texting scandal. There was a serious question as to whether or not he would win at all. And then in New Jersey, you had Mikey Sherrill, former congresswoman, kept the governorship in Democratic hands. That got a lot tighter as we got closer to election day, but she also won by double digits. Again, not something people were expecting. So broadly, Democrats did well there, and local races and ballot measures too. I'm sure folks were following what was happening in California with Proposition 50, which is the redistricting amendment that allowed for them to redistrict in kind as a reaction to what happened in Texas and is happening in other states. So broadly, taking a step back and then just kind of taking a finger on the pulse of voter mood, Democrats are being, seen as much more enthusiastic about 2026 than Republicans are, even though the generic ballot is essentially tied. And again, as I said before, folks are citing the cost of living as their number one issue by a long shot. And Democrats are seen as having an edge on that, partially because of what's been going on over the course of the last 8 months. A number of things that Democrats can point to, policies the administration is pushing that do not address or actually, exacerbate those concerns and those problems. So looking at 2026, to your point, Tushar, sorry,
No,
I
this
think,
is great stuff.
we shouldn't read too much into into the election results, given that it is a year out and it's an off-year election. But they were definitely a backlash against kind of Trump era governance and the shutdown. And it was particularly acute in suburbs and among college educated voters. And, again, the caveat is these are low turnout off year contests where the electorate's going to be very different next year. It's going to be larger turnout. It's going to be a different electorate, not the, super engaged like you do in an off year. And then there's going to be a much more broad, national argument about the economy and Trump's governing record at that point. So those are kind of the dynamics that I'm going to be watching going into next year.
Got it. And how does the congressional map look, both in the House and the Senate? Does one favor one party over the other?
Sure. So, Republicans have a very narrow margin in the House right now. And, folks that I follow, sort of the nonpartisan handicappers like Cook Political Report, Sabato, those guys all basically have 2026 as a jump ball, with a large number of competitive suburban districts in New York, California, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Arizona, a few others as kind of being where they're focusing. And that's kind of where the fight's going to be had. And then you've also got the impact of redistricting that has to be taken into account. So California's redistricting measure likely helps Democrats. They're projecting that should net 5 seats, but that's a wash if you look at Texas's 5 seats at this point. However, the outcome of the Tuesday elections show that there could very well be a degrading of the Trump the Trump wins from 2024 and his inroads in to certain populations that were being wrapped into the calculation around the maps in Texas. So those could actually be more competitive than I think the map makers had originally intended. More competitive for Democrats is what I mean. So there are those things that you have to take into account. And then historically, a midterm under a Republican president and under a trifecta of control under one party is going to benefit the party out of power. And of course, that's the Democrats. So that, typically gives you a slight structural nudge towards Democrats in the House, assuming the economy isn't booming. So if, strangely, the economy is going gangbusters, then all of that's out the window, and Republicans will benefit. But I think at this point there is still a slight edge for Democrats in the House. Now looking at the Senate, it's a little different. Republicans currently have 53 seats to 47, and there are 35 seats up right now. And Democrats in the most vulnerable seats include Ossoff in Georgia. And then you've got Democrat-held seats in open seats in Michigan with Senator Peters retiring, and then open New Hampshire and Minnesota seats, plus competitive seats in Virginia, New Jersey, and New Mexico. So they have to hold all those states. And then there could be some potential pickup opportunities for Democrats in places like Maine, excuse me, where Governor Mills, there are others in the primary, but Governor Mills just got in, and she's seen as the odds-on favorite for that primary, challenging Senator Collins. And then you've got in North Carolina, Tom Tillis going against Michael Whatley, former RNC chair. You've got Governor Cooper going against former RNC chair Michael Whatley, given Tom Tillis's retirement. And then you've got the Ohio special with Sherrod Brown getting back into the race. So again, Republicans odds on to maintain their majority in the Senate, but it's looking better for Democrats now than it did, 6-7 months ago. And again, also the recruiting wins that the Democrats have been able to notch should not be ignored. Governor Cooper was a big get in North Carolina that makes that state incredibly competitive, and a few others across the country.
Great, that's very helpful. David, I know you got to run, so I just want to ask a couple of questions that are in the chat. One is like, what you talked about the midterms, and typically that means less time to less time to work in Washington in Congress. Are there any other issues that of that may be popping up or need to be addressed in Congress? Obviously, we have ACA appropriations, and I would imagine that they're hoping to get past this one and maybe start for FY27. But is that, is there only room for that, or are there other things that are being considered?
Yes. So, obviously most of the focus right now is going to be on that next cliff into next year. So, a lot of focus on how we're going to fund the government for the remainder of FY26. And then, of course, at the same time, you're going to have FY27 conversations starting to happen, and deadlines for requests and for stakeholder engagement and for the advocates from the arts community to go up and, talk to their members. All of that's going to have to continue to happen going into this next deadline, but also, simultaneously having those conversations as they gear up for FY27. But beyond that, there are a number of things that they've got to get taken care of. You've got FAA reauthorization, you've got Farm Bill extensions that are going to need to be taken into account, nuclear energy issues that have to be extended, other healthcare extenders. You've got big transportation and water infrastructure extensions that have to take place. So there are other things that will be taking, that will be done. But it's just, there's not a ton of time, which means that new things, I know I was talking to a number of clients, that are looking to try to get, certain bills that they've been working on for years incorporated into a year-end package. Those types of things are likely going to have to slip into the next half of the session next year, post January. And, again, continuing to monitor and seeing what that looks like, but it's a lot to be done in a real squeezed time.
Thanks. And then just the final question. We have our good friend Ann Wicks asking about NEA numbers. If we think it's going to be closer to the Senate number, which is 207 million, or closer to the House 135 million. We have heard from Chairman Simpson that he is hoping that, or he thinks that number is going to be closer to the Senate number, as you kind of indicated in general. And then just adding on to that question is, what can advocates be doing during this time to make a difference in that final number?
Absolutely. I think having, constituents reaching out to members and continuing to talk to those folks that are our champions, that just need to, hear that, yes, we're paying attention. Yes, this money is incredibly important, and focusing on, the fact that it is a huge impact to the, economy and jobs, and really focusing on that, because again, I think people are starting to calibrate the way they legislate, but also, of course, their messaging around affordability and, kitchen table issues. So if you can, frame things and frame arts funding in that way, and talking about the impact that it has on communities, small businesses, the economy, I think that'll be hugely impactful. And wrapping it into something that folks are going to want to latch onto and be able to say, like, here it is that I'm supporting something that is helping you. These dollars are going directly to the community to, help the, after school arts program, or, to support this theater that helps to bolster this downtown area, and driving tourism and the like. I think those kinds of conversations should absolutely continue. And then again, as I said, FY27 conversations are going to be starting up, real soon. So this can parlay into those conversations as well.
Great. Well, thank you, David. I know that you're traveling and busy. So thank you so much for your time. There's no one that we trust more than you to give us insight on how to advocate what's going on in the Hill. So thank you again. We really appreciate your time, and we appreciate you. Thank you.
Well, appreciate everything you all are doing, and looking forward to the good work ahead.
Great. Safe travels.
Take care.
And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our very own Olivia Tarpley. Hi, Olivia.
Hi, Tushar. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Lots of great information coming from you and David. We are going to transition to to some numbers to talk about the funding ask. So much appreciation to our audience member for asking that great question about funding. We'll review all of that information now. Again, my name is Olivia Tarpley. I'm the Public Policy Manager here at Americans for the Arts. I am a white woman with short, dark brown hair. I'm currently with an abstract design, and I'm seated in my office in Washington, D.C. with art on the wall behind me. Specifically focusing in on the federal funding streams that affects arts and culture and arts education, given that we have just finished the longest government shutdown in history. We wanted to make sure that you all as advocates have all the numbers you need to continue your great advocacy work. So we've just been talking with David and Tushar about the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Of course, those are both funded through the Interior, Environment, and Related Agencies Bill. Last year for FY stands for fiscal year, in FY25, both agencies received funding of $207 million each. Then we were disheartened when President Trump's budget was released and he zeroed out both agencies. The House put in $135 million, which is about a 35% cut, but the Senate has included level funding, again, for both agencies in the Interior, Environment, and Related Agencies bill. So we are encouraging advocates. We ourselves are asking for $207 million each for both agencies. And this ask we coordinate with arts and culture organizations across the country. So you're in excellent company as far as making this ask when you're reaching out to your members of Congress. And I should just say that we coordinate all of the asks that I'm going to talk about with our fellow advocates and, state, local, and national partners. Next up, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, abbreviated to IMLS, was funded in FY25 at $294.8 million. Again, President Trump zeroed out this agency in his budget proposal. However, the House and the Senate have included a bit less than level funding in both of their bills. So we're moving forward with a level funding ask for IMLS of $294.8 million. And these last two rows here, both agencies, IMLS and CPB, are funded through the Labor, Health and Human Services, Education, and Related Agencies Bill, which we abbreviate to Labor HHS Ed. So the Corporation for Public Broadcasting last fiscal year was funded at $535 million. President Trump proposed zeroing out this agency, and the House and Senate followed suit. Unfortunately, CPB was included in the rescissions package that passed in July of this year. So the federal funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcast, unfortunately, is going away. However, we have been talking with our fellow partners and advocates that are advocates for public media, and they have been requesting that funds be directed to local stations. So we are amplifying that ask, and if you would like to join the fight for public media, we'll have a link here shortly to share for Protect Our Public Media. And then we'll head over to the next slide and talk about some arts education funding. So all of these programs are funded through the, again, Labor, Health and Human Services and Education Bill, managed by the Department of Education. The first program is the Assistance for Arts Education Program. That is a model grant program, and last fiscal year it was funded at $36.5 million. President Trump and the House did not include any funding for this program, but the Senate has included $31.5 million. Our ask, along with advocates that speak up for arts education, is $40 million. So we are maintaining that ask as we continue to encourage funding for this really important federal program. The next four rows here are all title funding, which is part of the Every Student Succeeds Act, the most recent iteration of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. This was formerly called No Child Left Behind. So for Education Title I, Part A, this is the grant for low-income students. Last year, the funding for the program was $18.39 billion with a B. And President Trump actually gave Title I a bit of an increase in his budget proposal. Unfortunately, though, the House has recommended a significant decrease, and the Senate is coming in at a little bit more than level funding from last fiscal year. So our ask is for $18.68 billion. Education, Title II, Part A is professional development for educators, and arts educators can access these funds, which is why we advocate for them in our arts education asks. $2 billion was included in FY25 funding, and President Trump and the House Appropriations Subcommittee zeroed out the program, but the Senate has included level funding from last year, and our advocacy ask is $3 billion. The last two rows here are part of Education Title IV. Part A is for student support and enrichment grants. Similarly, President Trump has zeroed out this program as he did in some of the other title funding, but the House and Senate have both approved level funding in their bills. So we are asking for at least level funding, but specifically we're asking for a bit of an increase, $1.6 billion. And then last but not least, Education Title IV Part B is for 21st Century Community Learning Centers, funded last fiscal year at $1 billion, about $1 billion. And again, the House and Senate has included level funding, and we're asking for $2 billion. So I know that's a lot of numbers. I'm sure that some of the questions in the Q&A box are related to seeing the chart, and we do have a slide available on a website that we will drop into the chat here shortly. So some folks might also recall that over the summer, some of the education title funds were being held up and not being dispersed by the Department of Education. Happy to share that as an update that they were released. So I think that just goes to show that advocacy is working. Your members of Congress are hearing you, and they're being responsive. So that I think concludes our funding update, and we're going to bring Tushar back to answer some questions from the Q&A box. We've just put the chart into the chat. Thank you so much, Morgan. Tushar, it looks like we have a question about some of the funding here. The first one is asking if the $3 million difference between the ask and approved appropriations for IMLS is tied to any particular program.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Institute for Museum and Library Services funds two things. It funds the libraries portion, which is called the Library Services Technology Act, and then it funds the Office of Museum Services, and within that, it funds what's called the Museum Services Act, the American Latino Museum Act, and the African American History and Culture Act. So those three comprise the Office of Museum Services Act, and there have been slight cuts on that side. But again, that is funded if you're going to separate, or if you want to separate the two out on the Office and Museum Services Act side, there's about a $2.5–3 million decrease, and that's where the funding is potentially being lost in both the Senate and the House. But we are still advocating for at least level funding because, as David said, that it looks like that there is potential to move the number closer to the Senate side on the top lines, or the top lines. And so hopefully we can make adjustments that way.
Great, thanks, Tushar. Our next question is if the NEA FY26 funding is currently set to be approved on January 30th. So I think this a little bit goes back to the conversation you were having with David. Right now, the House has 135 million for the NEA in their bill, and the Senate has 207 million in their bill. So often, historically, in kind of a maybe normal-ish environment, the two would come together and conference the bills. In the past few years, when the House and Senate have had differences in funding levels, the House has gone with the Senate numbers. So what are you thinking, Tushar, as far as how NEA funding specifically might shake out? Are we waiting to kind of just see what happens next?
Yeah, I think that we have talked to some of the key players on the Interior Appropriations Subcommittee, and so this is the committee that handles appropriations funding for the Department of Interior. And while the NEA and NEH are independent agencies, their funding is allocated through these appropriations bills, and so meeting with those subcommittee members is important. One is Chairman Mike Simpson, he's chairman on the House side, and then on the Senate side is Senator Lisa Murkowski from Alaska. And we have talked to both of them. They have both actually assured us that it's going to be closer to the Senate number. Our goal is to actually make it the Senate number. So we feel like that there is more work that needs to be done from an advocacy standpoint, which is why the work of advocates right now to reach out to their members of Congress is critical and important.
Thanks, Tushar. It looks like our last question in the chat you were actually typing an answer to, but the question was related to the DOGE cuts that happened at the beginning of this year. That stands for Department of Government Efficiency. And is it looking like the agencies, I'm thinking this person might be wondering specifically about the cultural agencies, will they be back at full staffing levels? Specifically, do we know what's happening with the dance staff? I have not personally heard an update about the dance staff specifically, but Tushar, do you have some more insight on maybe the broad strokes?
Yeah, well, the broad strokes for sure. We can try to find that answer out specifically on the dance staff, which was why after this I can type my email address in, and you can, or you want to contact me, we can try to find that information out. The DOGE cuts, do remain in effect. The package that just passed, the federal employees were coming back, and what was reversed was the reductions in force that occurred during the shutdown. So they are able to come back. The staffs at the NEA, at the NEH, and at IMLS, specifically NEH and IMLS, have been hit hard. I think that IMLS staff went from 78 employees to 12. NEH, I believe, had close to 70% of reductions in force of their employees. And the NEA as well, though, because of the great work by Marianne Carter, who is the nominee for NEA chair. The cuts haven't been as severe, and they've actually hired back a number of people. They've been able to do that. So obviously they're very constrained in the work that they're doing, and that's why you might be seeing delays if you have questions regarding your grants. But we can get back to you specifically on what is happening, specifically with the dance staff. I don't have that answer right now.
Awesome. Thanks for those insights, Tushar. Thank you all so much for your questions and also for your presence today. We really appreciate everything that each of you do in your respective communities. We know it all affects the arts and culture across the nation. So we're here for you to answer your questions. We're going to transition back to Morgan for a few last pieces of information, and we'll make sure to be dropping links into the chat as we wrap up. So thank you all so much.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm back. Thank you, Olivia. Thank you, Tushar. And thank you, David, for a great webinar today. I think just having these webinars on this cadence has been so great, and we really appreciate everyone who shows up and then also shares what they've learned. I think that's one of the most important parts of all of this, is that we're making sure it's not just us here, but it continues to go outward. So with that being said, we have 2 areas where you can take action today. So first of all, we've pre-drafted a Protect the NEA email letter for you. It takes less than 2 minutes to send, and it goes directly to your senators and your House of Representatives. Personalized messages from constituents are one of the most effective tools we have in federal advocacy. So there is a place where you're able to customize your message specifically to your member of Congress. So if you know a little bit of something about them, if they attended an event recently back in district, you can always mention that, and it shows that extra warmth and that extra connection. And right now, what we are looking for and what everyone is looking for is that connection. Also, we have a call script that's ready for you, and a call takes less than 60 seconds, but the congressional offices track every single one, and they report back to leadership. So when they hear from us in large numbers, it moves votes. We all know this, and we're going to continue to make sure that emails and calls are our main source of getting to them, and also being able to make those in-district meetings, meetings on the Hill, anything we can do in these final months as we lead up to that vote. The links on this slide will take you to both resources, so please take action and share it with your networks. Your voice truly makes a difference on the national level. So next slide. You'll find all past office hours recordings and resources on the AFTA webpage on the screen. So americansforthearts.org/advocate/office-hours. The recording from today's webinar will be up at the beginning of next week. So you'll get an email via Zoom with the link, but we'll also make sure to send one out to everyone. Please use that link and share it around, because I think this was such a great update so that people are aware of what we're walking into in the final months of 2025 and getting into 2026. Next slide. Our final office hours session is December 12th, so you can go ahead and register now at that same link. We are really thrilled to be able to close out strong. We've loved being able to connect more with you all this year, and we're going to make sure to continue that in 2026. So go ahead and sign up, and you will hear more about what we have in store for office hours in 2026 during that time. And then just this last slide here for all of us is, before we wrap up, I wanted to invite you to join us in a powerful effort that Americans for the Arts is conducting called 50 Stories, 50 States. We know that the stories we all share connect us. They show who we are and how the arts and humanities have shaped our communities and our lives, right? And at a time when federal arts and humanities funding, especially NEA and NEH, is under real pressure, your stories matter more than ever. So that's why Americans for the Arts has launched a national storytelling campaign to highlight how creativity strengthens our democracy, fuels our economy, and impacts our everyday lives. We're asking people across the country to share a 30-second video about what the arts and humanities mean to them. You can participate by recording a short video on your phone and uploading it using the link in the chat. Share it with your networks, artists, educators, veterans, small business owners, community leaders, everyone who kind of touches the arts and culture community. Our goal isn't just about 50 stories. It's about hundreds of voices showing why the arts and humanities are essential to America's future. We know your voice matters. Please understand how much it really does. And we hope you'll join us in this. Okay. Thank you all so much again for being here with us today. You will get the webinar recording soon, and we hope you have a wonderful weekend. Thanks so much.